Thomas Mitchell was a man who appeared to have it all. At 44 years old, he had built a successful career as a real estate agent in the quiet, affluent suburbs of Greenfield, a small town just outside New York City. His charm, coupled with a keen eye for property investments, had allowed him to amass a significant fortune. Thomas had always been the kind of man others envied: charismatic, confident, and seemingly content with his lot in life. He was married to Grace, a woman known for her kindness and patience. Grace was 42, a loving wife who had supported Thomas throughout his career. She was a schoolteacher, admired by her colleagues and adored by her students. Grace and Thomas had been married for over 20 years, and although their relationship had its ups and downs like any long-term marriage, they were generally seen as the ideal couple by those who knew them. Their large, beautifully maintained house was a testament to their success and stability, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn and a white picket fence. They had no children by choice, focusing instead on their careers and enjoying the quiet, comfortable life they had created together. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, Thomas harbored a secret, a growing obsession that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. It began innocently enough, as most dangerous desires do. Thomas was a man who had always been somewhat restless, despite his achievements. He had a wandering eye, though he had never acted on it before. His marriage to Grace had settled into a predictable routine, and while he loved her in his way, the spark that once ignited their relationship had long since dimmed. Emily Rogers was the spark that reignited something in Thomas, a desire he hadn't felt in years. Emily was 29 years old, a strikingly beautiful woman with long, chestnut brown hair and bright green eyes that seemed to sparkle with life. She had an air of youthful energy about her, something that Thomas found intoxicating. Emily had moved to Greenfield just a few years ago with her husband, Robert, who was 35 and worked as an IT consultant for a large firm in the city. They had been married for only 3 years, and their relationship was still fresh with the passion and excitement that Thomas so desperately missed in his own life. Emily and Robert's house was right next to the Mitchells, separated only by a low hedge. The Rogers home was a bit smaller and more modest than the Mitchells, but it was well kept, reflecting the care and pride that Emily took in her surroundings. Emily often spent her afternoons gardening or taking long walks around the neighborhood, and it was during these times that Thomas first began to notice her. At first, it was nothing more than a passing thought, a simple appreciation of her beauty as he watched her from the window of his home office. But as the days turned into weeks, those passing thoughts grew into something more. Thomas found himself looking forward to glimpsing Emily as she went about her day. He began to manufacture reasons to be outside at the same time as her, hoping for a chance encounter, a brief conversation, or even just a smile from her. Grace, meanwhile, was oblivious to the growing obsession taking root in her husband's mind. She trusted Thomas completely, never suspecting that he could be capable of such thoughts. Grace and Emily had become friendly over the past few years, often chatting when they ran into each other at the local grocery store or during neighborhood gatherings. Grace admired Emily's youthful spirit and her love for life, seeing in her the woman she had once been before the weight of years and responsibilities had dulled her own spark. Thomas's initial attraction to Emily was physical, but it quickly evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. He began to imagine what it would be like to be with her, to feel the thrill of an affair. These fantasies became a way for Thomas to escape from the monotony of his daily life. When Grace would leave for work in the mornings, Thomas would find himself daydreaming about Emily, about what it would be like to hold her, to kiss her, to feel her body against his. These thoughts both excited and terrified him. Thomas knew that what he was feeling was wrong, that it could destroy everything he had built with Grace. But the more he tried to push these thoughts away, the stronger they became. It was as if a door had been opened in his mind, and now there was no way to close it. He began to study Emily's routine closely, learning her habits and preferences. He noticed that she enjoyed reading on her front porch in the afternoons, often with a glass of iced tea in hand. He learned that she favored a particular brand of coffee from the local cafe, where she would sometimes stop after her morning runs. Thomas started frequenting these places, hoping to run into her by chance. Each interaction, however brief, fueled his obsession further. Emily, for her part, saw nothing unusual in Thomas's behavior. She was naturally friendly and outgoing, and she appreciated the attention from her neighbor. In her mind, Thomas was simply a nice man who enjoyed a bit of harmless banter. She never suspected that his interest in her went far beyond casual conversation. As Thomas's fixation on Emily grew, his relationship with Grace began to suffer. The once loving husband became distant and irritable, often lost in thought or preoccupied with his fantasies. Grace noticed the change but couldn't understand the reason behind it. She tried to talk to Thomas to ask if something was bothering him, but he always brushed off her concerns with vague reassurances that he was just tired or stressed from work. Grace's attempts to reconnect with Thomas were met with indifference. He no longer seemed interested in the things they used to enjoy together: weekend getaways, quiet dinners at their favorite restaurant, or even just watching a movie on the couch. Instead, Thomas spent more and more time alone, either at work or in his study at home, where he would sit and brood over his thoughts of Emily. The emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing day. Grace, feeling increasingly lonely and neglected, began to doubt herself. She wondered if she had done something to drive Thomas away, or if he was simply losing interest in her after all these years. Despite her efforts to rekindle the romance in their marriage, Grace felt like she was fighting a losing battle. One evening, as Thomas sat alone in his study, his mind once again drifted to thoughts of Emily. But this time, his fantasy took a darker turn. He imagined what it would be like to act on his desires, to pursue Emily despite the risks. The thought thrilled him, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his body. But it also frightened him because deep down, he knew that if he crossed that line, there would be no going back. Thomas tried to shake off the fantasy, to remind himself of the consequences. But the idea had already taken root, and no matter how hard he tried to suppress it, it kept coming back, stronger and more persistent each time. It was as if his mind was at war with itself, torn between the man he knew he should be and the man he was becoming. The more Thomas thought about it, the more he began to rationalize his feelings. He told himself that he deserved to be happy, that he had earned the right to indulge in a little excitement after all these years. He convinced himself that no one would have to know, that it could be their little secret. And the more he entertained these thoughts, the less guilty he felt. As Thomas's fantasies grew more intense, so did his efforts to get closer to Emily. He started finding excuses to spend time with her, offering to help with small tasks around her house, or suggesting they go for a walk together when Robert was away on business trips. Emily, still unaware of the depths of Thomas's obsession, accepted his offers with gratitude, enjoying his company as she would any good neighbor. These interactions only served to deepen Thomas's feelings for Emily. Every smile, every laugh, every touch, however innocent, felt like an affirmation of his fantasies. He began to interpret her friendliness as something more, convincing himself that she felt the same way about him. But as Thomas grew bolder, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He started taking risks, making suggestive comments that left Emily feeling uneasy. At first, she dismissed them as harmless jokes, but as they became more frequent, she began to feel uncomfortable around him. Grace, meanwhile, noticed the growing friendship between Thomas and Emily, but she didn't think much of it. She trusted her husband and believed that his intentions were innocent. Besides, Grace and Emily had become friends as well, often spending time together when their husbands were at work. The idea that Thomas could be developing feelings for Emily never crossed Grace's mind. Despite his growing obsession, Thomas knew that he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to let his feelings slip out of control, not when so much was at stake. But the more he tried to resist, the more difficult it became. The line between fantasy and reality was beginning to blur, and Thomas found himself losing control. He started to doubt himself, questioning whether he was capable of keeping his feelings in check. The guilt that had once plagued him was slowly being replaced by a sense of entitlement, a belief that he was owed something more than the life he had. But alongside this growing arrogance was a nagging fear of what was. As Thomas's obsession with Emily deepened, his once rational mind began to unravel, consumed by a dangerous mix of desire and jealousy. He could no longer separate his fantasies from reality, and his every thought was dominated by the idea of possessing Emily. The obsession, which had started as a fleeting distraction, now consumed him entirely. At first, Thomas tried to maintain some semblance of control. He continued to perform his duties at work, managing his real estate business with the same efficiency and charm that had made him successful. But even as he closed deals and interacted with clients, his mind was elsewhere, fixated on the moments he could steal with Emily. His behavior at home became increasingly erratic. Grace noticed the changes in him, but she attributed it to stress from work. She tried to be supportive, giving Thomas space when he seemed distant and offering comfort when he appeared troubled. But Thomas's thoughts were far from work. They were fixated on the neighbor next door, who had unknowingly become the center of his world. Thomas's interactions with Emily grew more frequent and increasingly bold. He would find excuses to be near her, often appearing in her yard under the pretense of offering help. Whether it was trimming the hedges or fixing a leaky faucet, Thomas was always there, always willing to lend a hand. Emily, still unaware of the depths of his obsession, welcomed his assistance, grateful for his neighborly kindness. However, there were moments when Emily noticed something strange in Thomas's behavior. His eyes would linger on her a little too long, his touch would be a bit too familiar, and his compliments would veer into territory that made her slightly uncomfortable. But Emily dismissed these moments as harmless. Thomas was, after all, a married man, and she trusted him as a friend. As the days passed, Thomas became more daring in his pursuit of Emily. He started to engineer situations where they would be alone together, creating opportunities that seemed innocent on the surface but were anything but. Whether it was inviting her over for a cup of coffee when Grace was out or suggesting they go for a walk together, Thomas always had a plan. Emily, while initially receptive, began to sense that something was off. There were moments when Thomas's attention felt too intense, too focused. She started to feel uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The man she had once seen as a friendly neighbor was beginning to feel like something else entirely. One afternoon, while they were having coffee on Thomas's porch, he made a comment that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. As they talked about mundane topics, Thomas suddenly leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, Emily, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be with someone who really understands me. Someone who sees me for who I am, not just as a husband or a businessman." Emily laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. The statement felt out of place, inappropriate even. She quickly changed the subject, but the moment lingered in her mind long after she left Thomas's house. Despite her growing discomfort, Emily didn't know how to address the situation. She didn't want to make things awkward between them, and she certainly didn't want to cause any tension between her and Grace, who had become a good friend. So, she continued to interact with Thomas, albeit more cautiously. Thomas's obsession reached a tipping point one evening when he found himself alone in his study, the room dark, except for the dim light of his desk lamp. He had been drinking, a habit that had become more frequent as his thoughts of Emily grew more intense. The alcohol loosened the tight grip he had tried to keep on his desires, and his fantasies took on a life of their own. In his mind, Thomas began to rewrite reality. He convinced himself that Emily felt the same way about him, that her friendly smiles and casual touches were signs of her own hidden desires. He told himself that she was just waiting for him to make the first move, that she was too shy to admit her feelings but was longing for him as much as he longed for her. The rational part of Thomas's mind, the part that knew this was all a dangerous delusion, was drowned out by the voices of his obsession. He began to fantasize about confronting Emily, about telling her how he felt and sweeping her off her feet. In his mind, he imagined her falling into his arms, their affair igniting with a passion that he hadn't felt in years. The next day, with his judgment still clouded by the lingering effects of alcohol and obsession, Thomas decided to act on his fantasies. He planned it out carefully, choosing a time when he knew Grace would be out of the house and Robert would be at work. He would invite Emily over under the guise of needing her opinion on something trivial, perhaps a piece of art he was considering for his office, and then he would finally tell her how he felt. As the day approached, Thomas's excitement grew. He was nervous, yes, but also exhilarated. This was what he had been waiting for, the moment when his fantasies would become reality. He was convinced that everything would go according to plan, that Emily would respond to his advances, and that they would begin the passionate affair he had dreamed of. When the day arrived, Thomas made sure everything was perfect. He straightened up his study, ensuring that the atmosphere was just right, dim lighting, soft music playing in the background, and a bottle of wine chilling on the side table. He rehearsed what he would say to Emily, how he would make her see that they were meant to be together. Emily arrived at the Mitchells' house that afternoon, unaware of what was about to unfold. She was dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She greeted Thomas with her usual friendly smile, though there was a slight edge of nervousness to it. The last few interactions with him had left her feeling uneasy, but she had pushed those feelings aside, hoping that this visit would be nothing more than a simple chat between neighbors. Thomas led Emily into his study, offering her a seat by the window. He poured them both a glass of wine, trying to keep his hands steady as he handed her the glass. Emily accepted it, though she took only a small sip, sensing that something was off. They talked for a few minutes, though the conversation was stilted and awkward. Thomas tried to steer the conversation toward more personal topics, but Emily kept deflecting, clearly uncomfortable with the direction he was taking. Finally, Thomas decided to take the plunge. "Emily," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I need to tell you something. Something I've been holding back for a long time." Emily's heart began to race. She could sense that whatever Thomas was about to say, it wasn't going to be good. She set her glass down, looking at him with wide, apprehensive eyes. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "I can't stop thinking about you, Emily. You've become the only thing I can think about. I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog. Emily felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was her neighbor, her friend's husband, the man she had trusted. And now he was confessing feelings that she had never even suspected. Emily stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Thomas, no, this isn't right. You're married. I'm married. We can't do this." But Thomas wasn't listening. He stood up as well, moving toward her with a desperation that frightened her. "You don't understand, Emily. I've never felt this way about anyone. You're all I think about. I know you feel the same way. You have to." Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, Thomas. I don't feel that way. I never have. You're making a mistake." But Thomas couldn't hear her. In his mind, her rejection was just a barrier that needed to be overcome, a challenge that he could conquer if only he could make her see the truth. He reached out, grabbing her arm to stop her from leaving. "Emily, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Just give me a chance. You'll see. We're meant to be together." But Emily wrenched her arm free, her voice rising in panic. "No, Thomas. This has to stop. I'm leaving." She turned and ran out of the study, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get away, had to put distance between herself and this man who had suddenly become a stranger. As she fled the house, she could hear Thomas calling after her, but she didn't stop. She ran all the way home, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Thomas stood in his study, his heart pounding, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He couldn't believe how wrong everything had gone. In his fantasies, Emily had always responded to his advances, had always seen things his way. But now, faced with the harsh reality of her rejection, Thomas felt as though his world was falling apart. The morning after Emily fled his house, Thomas woke with a crushing sense of despair. His head throbbed with the remnants of last night's alcohol, but it was the weight of his actions that truly caused him pain. The events of the previous day came rushing back to him with brutal clarity: his confession to Emily, her horrified reaction, and her desperate escape from his clutches. It was all too real, and the guilt that followed was overwhelming. He tried to tell himself that it had been a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, but deep down, Thomas knew better. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Emily had trusted him, seen him as a friend, and he had betrayed that trust in the most unforgivable way. The realization that he had terrified her, made her feel unsafe in her own home, filled him with self-loathing. Over the next few days, Thomas became a shadow of the man he once was. He went through the motions of his daily life, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a cycle of regret and shame. At work, his once sharp focus was dulled, his charm replaced by a hollow emptiness. He avoided his colleagues, unable to bear the thought of anyone seeing the darkness inside him. At home, the situation was even worse. Grace could sense that something was deeply wrong, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to talk to her about it. How could he? How could he tell the woman who had stood by him for so many years that he had fallen in love with someone else, and in the process destroyed everything? The guilt weighed heavily on him, creating an insurmountable distance between them. Grace tried to be supportive, giving Thomas space and offering comfort when she could, but he recoiled from her kindness. Every touch, every word of concern was a painful reminder of his betrayal. He felt like an imposter pretending to be a loving husband when, in reality, he was anything but. The love he had once felt for Grace was buried under layers of guilt and regret, and he feared it would never resurface. Emily, meanwhile, was grappling with her own demons. The encounter with Thomas had left her shaken, her sense of security shattered. She couldn't believe that the man she had trusted as a friend, the man she had seen as a kind and generous neighbor, had harbored such dark feelings for her. The thought made her skin crawl, and she found herself constantly on edge, wary of every shadow, every sound. For days, Emily replayed the incident in her mind, trying to make sense of it. She had known that Thomas was lonely, that his marriage to Grace seemed strained, but she had never imagined that his feelings for her ran so deep, or that they were so twisted. The realization that she had been the object of his obsession for so long was horrifying, and it left her feeling violated in a way she had never experienced before. Emily's first instinct was to cut off all contact with Thomas. She avoided going outside when she knew he might be around, and she ignored his calls and texts. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her, making her feel like a prisoner in her own home. She couldn't escape the thought that Thomas might try to confront her again, that he might not take her rejection well. The fear was irrational, she knew that, but it was also very real. Her husband, Robert, noticed the change in her immediately. Emily had always been strong, confident, but now she seemed anxious, withdrawn. He tried to talk to her, to find out what was bothering her, but Emily couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. How could she? How could she admit that their neighbor, someone they both trusted, had tried to force himself on her? The thought of Robert's reaction, of the potential fallout, was too much to bear. So Emily kept it to herself, bottling up her fear and anxiety, hoping that with time it would fade. But the nightmares persisted, the unease never quite leaving her. She knew that something had to change, but she didn't know what or how. All she knew was that she couldn't keep living in fear, but she also couldn't bring herself to confront the situation head-on. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas's obsession with Emily didn't fade. Instead, it morphed into something darker, more dangerous. The rejection had wounded him deeply, but instead of accepting it and moving on, Thomas became fixated on the idea that he could somehow make things right. His mind, already teetering on the edge, began to spiral further into delusion. He started to convince himself that Emily's rejection was not because she didn't care for him, but because she was afraid of the intensity of her own feelings, afraid of what their love could mean. It was a twisted justification, a way for Thomas to cling to the fantasy he had created in his mind. He told himself that if he could just talk to her, if he could just make her see, everything would be okay. Thomas's thoughts became increasingly erratic. He began to see signs where there were none, interpreting every glance, every gesture from Emily as a hidden message, a cry for help. He started to believe that she was waiting for him to take action, to rescue her from the mundane life she was trapped in. In his mind, they were star-crossed lovers, destined to be together despite the odds. The rational part of Thomas's mind knew that this was a dangerous delusion, but that voice was growing weaker by the day. The loneliness, the guilt, the despair, they all fed into his obsession, driving him further into the darkness. He began drinking more heavily, using alcohol to drown out the doubts and fears that plagued him. But the more he drank, the more his thoughts spiraled out of control. It wasn't long before Thomas started planning his next move. He knew he had to be careful, that he couldn't just confront Emily again, not after what had happened the last time. He had to approach her in a way that wouldn't scare her off, that would make her see that he was the only one who truly understood her. He became consumed with the idea of a grand gesture, something that would show Emily how much he cared, how far he was willing to go for her. One night, after yet another evening of heavy drinking, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wait any longer, he had to act. The thought of Emily slipping further away from him, of her living her life without him, was unbearable. In his mind, he was doing this for her. He was saving her from a life of mediocrity, of being trapped in a loveless marriage. Thomas left his house under the cover of darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He had planned this carefully, down to the last detail. He knew that Robert was out of town on a business trip, and that Emily would be home alone. This was his chance, his one shot to make things right. As he approached Emily's house, Thomas's mind raced with anticipation and fear. He could see the lights on in the living room, and he knew she was there. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, his mind filled with images of what was to come. He knocked, the sound echoing in the still night air, and waited. Emily answered the door, her face pale and drawn. She looked tired, as if the weight of the past few weeks had taken its toll on her. When she saw Thomas standing there, her eyes widened in fear. But before she could say anything, Thomas stepped forward, pushing his way into the house. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling, "we need to talk. You have to understand I did this for you." Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that it might come, but she had hoped that Thomas would stay away, that he would leave her alone. Now, faced with the reality of him standing in her living room, she felt a surge of panic. "Thomas, you need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Please just go. We can't. There's nothing to talk about." But Thomas wasn't listening. He moved closer, his eyes wild with desperation. "No, you don't understand. I love you, Emily. I've always loved you. I did everything for you, for us." Emily felt her back hit the wall, trapped. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, but Thomas was too close, his presence suffocating. She could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the madness in his eyes. He wasn't the same man she had known. He was a stranger, someone dangerous. "Thomas, please," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're scaring me. Just go home. We can forget this ever happened." But her words only seemed to fuel his obsession. Thomas reached out, grabbing her by the arms, his grip tight and painful. "I'm not leaving, Emily, not without you. We're meant to be together. I know you feel it too." Emily's fear turned to terror as she realized that there was no reasoning with him. He was beyond rational thought, lost in his own delusions. She tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. In that moment, she knew she had to do something, anything, to escape. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something she could use to defend herself. Her gaze landed on a lamp on the nearby table, its heavy base made of solid metal. Without thinking, she lunged for it, ripping it from its place and swinging it at Thomas with all her might. The lamp connected with the side of his head, the force of the blow sending him staggering back. For a moment, there was silence, the room frozen in time. Then, Thomas collapsed to the floor, blood trickling from the wound on his temple. Emily stood there, panting, the lamp still clutched in her trembling hands. She couldn't believe what she had done, couldn't believe that she had actually hurt someone. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and she dropped the lamp, backing away from Thomas's lifeless body. Her hands flew to her mouth as she let out a strangled sob. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. But there was no going back now. The man who had once been her friend, her neighbor, was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped Emily out of her shock. She had no idea how much time had passed, but the police were coming, and they would be here soon. She knew she had to tell them what happened, had to explain that she had acted in self-defense. But the thought of reliving the nightmare, of going through it all again, was too much to bear. As the sirens grew louder, Emily sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. The reality of what had happened, of what she had done, settled over her like a heavy shroud. There was no escaping it now, no running from the consequences. All she could do was wait, and hope that somehow, some way, she could find a way to move on from the tragedy that had unfolded in her living room.